At the conference at Hampton Court, the Puritans only by accident gained one concession from the king and therefore from the bishops, and that is what became the King James Version of the Bible. And we have not yet dealt, except in passing, with just how the Anglican bishops reacted to this translation proposal by the Puritans, by John Reynolds, who's the leader of the Puritans, and the king's acceptance of that. We just mentioned it in passing. I thought I would just specify that one more time, and then we'll go beyond that this morning. Because they realized that the publication of a new Bible would have the effect not only of rendering over a short period of time, within a few decades, the Geneva Bible as superfluous, which would be fine for them, because that was the Puritan Bible, but it would also render as unnecessary the Bishop's Bible, which is what the Anglicans had been using, the Church of England, the bishops up to this time, and something that they were very fond of. But, of course, as soon as John Reynolds suggests this to the king, all the other suggestions, the list of a dozen things in the millenary petition, simply are not acceptable to him. Well, the king likes this because of the reasons we concluded with last time. He's a literary man. It puffs up his vanity. He can go down in history. He can appear as a peacemaker in the church, and all of these reasons. Now, as soon as Richard Bancroft sees the king's response, which is a positive one, Bancroft pretty much being the leader of the Anglican cause, he saw that the king had pleasure in this idea. Well, for Bancroft and the Anglicans to remain on the side of the king, they have no choice but to agree with the Puritans. And so this touches on what we concluded with last time, that the king would appear to be a peacemaker here. Because he likes the idea, the Puritans obviously like the idea, the Anglicans are going to have to like the idea if they want to stay in the king's graces. So as soon as they recognize that the king is leaning in favor of a new Bible, then Bancroft and the other bishops who are with him just join the bandwagon. Their idea is, well, we didn't want a new Bible. We already have the bishop's Bible. Since the king likes it, we're going to have to like it. So since we are, let's do the best of our liking. And his thought would be, all right, we'll do a new Bible. And we'll make it better as far as our thoughts are concerned. We'll make it better than the bishop's Bible. They have no idea of somehow supporting Puritan doctrine in their Bible. They want to support the doctrine of the Church of England. So that's kind of where we left off last time and where we are right now with the conference at Hampton Court. Now, we're ending on the final note of the conference where pretty much all the people agree. The king is happy, the Puritans are more or less happy, the Anglicans are happy. The Puritans got something, the Anglicans didn't lose many things, and the king is in the middle as peacemaker. So they're all happy. The conference had a happy ending. It had a happy ending for us as well with the production of this Bible. By the way, Archbishop Whitgift caught a cold and had a stroke and died the last day of February of 1604, about a month and a half after the conference ended. The conference is around January the 16th, 1604. Archbishop Whitgift was the leading Anglican clergyman in England at this time, being Archbishop of Canterbury. Now his sidekick, the one who played second fiddle to him, was Richard Bancroft, who was Bishop of London. Bishop of London Bancroft now is elevated to the Archbishop of Canterbury. And he had more or less been acting as such for the old man Whitgift for the last 5 years, since Whitgift was old and sickly. So I told you last time you would not have to be remembering some of these names very long. And I just gave you Whitgift's name, I think, 2 messages ago, so you can already drop him now. He dies, catches a cold, then has a stroke, and dies the last day of February in 1604. And he's too old really to figure in with the work that's being done. So the only one who's important that we've discussed for the Anglicans thus far is Richard Bancroft. Now the first step in producing the translation was you've got to gather the scholars together. This is what's needed next. So they decide to gather the most learned, leading biblical scholars that England had to offer, both Anglican and Puritan. And we're going to be working our way into these men's lives, name by name by name. That may seem a little tedious to go over many of their backgrounds. I'll try to be abbreviated in what I say, unless the people are very important, such as Lancelot Andrews or Richard Bancroft himself. He'll be one of the ones involved here. Or some of the other important men, like Reynolds, John Reynolds, the first one that we've mentioned. I don't think it'll be that boring. We're going to mention some of the men this morning just because they are on the committee of the selection of scholars, but we'll come back to them whenever it's necessary. And I think it's necessary to look at these men if we want to have a thorough knowledge of the backgrounds of the KJV, who the men are. We know very specifically who these men were and what they were like, who did the work of the translation. Now, there were 3 steps in the process of the selection of the translators. James is the one who draws all of this up at the conference. He is so excited about the work, the new Bible being done, that he wants to begin immediately. So the conference comes to an end that week in mid-January of 1604. He goes to his royal residence, the King's Tower, watches the lions tear the dogs to pieces. And then in the spring, once the weather finally lifts and good weather settles in the spring of 1604, they actually set about the work of the selection of the scholars. Now, one thing about our studies here is there are a lot of different numbers to remember. Some of them dates, some of them numbers as far as the men, the number of translators is concerned. But we kind of date, there's 3 important dates for the King James Bible. 1604, they begin kind of informally, I guess I would say. Informally gathering the men together or selecting the men, reviewing the list of the potential scholars. I'll give you the 3 steps in selecting them here in a moment. Some of those men began to work privately at home, just on tidbits of translation work, maybe brushing up in Hebrew, brushing up in Greek, something like that. That lasts until 1607. The Bible does not actually begin, the committees do not actually begin to meet officially and do the translating work until 3 years from right now, 1607. And then it's completed in 1611. It's finally published in 1611. It goes through a completion, then it goes through a revision and all of this, and then finally it's through in 1611. Now I'll give you other dates, especially in between 1607 and 11, but those are the 3 chief ones to remember. Informally they begin 1604. Formally they begin in 1607. And then 4 years later in 1611 the Bible comes out. Now that's remarkable because you take a Bible, well, like any of them today, New American Standard, New International Version, New American Bible, Jerusalem Bible, any of the versions, the Revised Standard, and we're talking about decades that they worked on these Bibles. The Jewish Publication Society, which began giving us a new Jewish translation of the Old Testament, as I've given you before in this class, published their first volumes back in 1962 or 3 or 4 along there, and they're still not through. So we're 2 decades removed from that, 25 years removed from that, and they're still not through. So 4 years is a remarkable period of time to have this whole Bible done and for it to be as complete as the King James is. And really, of course, it wasn't 4 years, it was like 2 years. And then it went through some revision before they finally come out with it. So 2 or 3 years is a remarkably short period of time for them to be through. Here are the steps leading to the selection of the men. See, if you would have been a noted Hebrew, Greek linguist in that day, you would have been on the committee. If you had a good temper. One man who was famous for his learning had a bad temper, and so he was excluded. And he criticized the publication of the KJV once it came out. I wonder why. Well, one, he had been on his own translating work for 30 years, and he never got through. And he died, and the King James translators did it in 2 and beat him, and he didn't like that. We'll discuss his arguments against the KJV later. Number 1, James's 3 steps in the process of selection. Number 1, letters were to be sent throughout the entire country seeking the best Hebrew and Greek scholars who had, and I quote the king, taken pains in their private study of the Scriptures. Taken pains in their private study of the Scriptures. So said the king. So you see, this is kind of an informal preliminary step to anything that's really going to take place. Send letters out and locate who are the best scholars. Let them know what the king plans now. The Puritans only have 4 representatives here at the council, remember, or at the conference. The Anglicans only have 50. Surely there are more Anglican and Puritan scholars than that living in England. They're not all aware of what's going on. Maybe they live way up in northern England, so they have to be alerted by these letters. But this is very preliminary. This is kind of just putting your feeler out, taking a poll to see what the water is like. And secondly, the findings from these letters being sent out were then to be reported to one of 3 men who were on the committee of selection. And these 3 men were directly appointed by the king. The findings of these 3 letters were then to be reported to the committee of selection, the committee that actually selected the translators, made up of 3 men. One, John Harding, Harding, John Harding. 2, Edward Lively, Lively, Edward Lively. And 3, Lancelot Andrews. Lancelot Andrews. Andrews. So we've got 3 men now that we know, 3 in addition to the ones we discussed before. Harding, Lively, and Andrews. And then thirdly, they were then to provide the king with their suggestions from the list of men solicited. The king would make final appointment, but he pretty much went according to what Harding, Lively, and Andrews had to say. They were all noted scholars. Now, before looking at the results of this process of selection, let me take a little time just to briefly discuss these three men, John Harding, Edward Lively, and Lancelot Andrews. Now, since these 3 men are also on the translating team, we'll come across them, their names, their backgrounds again. And I won't take the time when I come across them the second time to discuss in any repetitious detail what I've already said now. But I'll have some additional information to say about them then that's more appropriate for then than now. But I will refer you back to what we're going to say about them right now. First of all, John Harding, not much to say about him because the least amount is known of him in comparison to the other 2. We know that he was a Hebrew reader at Oxford. He was a Puritan. And he was one of the committee's chairmen. As you'll see how we divide this up, with 6 different groups meeting in 3 different places. You'd have 6 different chairmen then. He is a chairman of one of the Oxford groups of translators. You have different teams of translators that meet at different places. And he happens to be, he ends up being a chairman of one of the Oxford groups. 2 groups meet at Oxford. That would make sense with him being a Hebrew reader at Oxford. So a Hebrew reader means like a professor, a lecturer in Hebrew, in the Old Testament at Oxford University. And he's a Puritan. Now, just because these 3 men are on the selection committee doesn't necessarily mean they're going to end up as translators, but that does happen to be the case here. These 3 men do end up as actual translators, and we know which portions of Scripture they took. We will look at that later. Secondly, Edward Lively. For 30 years, so he must be an older man, he had held the Hebrew chair at Cambridge. They're going to meet at 3 places: Oxford, Cambridge, and Westminster. So here we've covered a second place already. Harding just happened to be a reader in Hebrew at Oxford. He ends up chairing one of the Oxford translation teams. Edward Lively held the Hebrew chair at Cambridge University for 30 years. Now, a little interesting biographical background for this man. He was a perpetual workaholic. All of his life was one of work. We're told by those who have written biographies of him. Because, first of all, of his religious inclination, studying and teaching Hebrew in the Old Testament, and because of the size of his family. Unlike many of the other translators, he was married, and his wife bore him 13 children. So his life was one of work to provide for them. If anyone deserves our attention and sympathy, it's Edward Lively. Now, it was such a struggle for them in this family that his wife finally just gave up the ghost and died. That's what I've read about her. She didn't die of really any causes. She just got worn out with the children. I hope that's not a prophecy of any of you, but she just finally gave up the ghost and died, leaving him 11 surviving children. So he's professor of Hebrew and father of 11, and now he's on the committee of selecting the translators, and one of those whom he selects is himself. Now, you have to also realize that in this day and age, people, professors, pastors, bishops, they made a meager living unless you were way up in a high church like Bancroft is Archbishop of Canterbury. So being a professor, being a lecturer, he made hardly anything at all. And to have to provide without a wife for 11 surviving children was just almost beyond, comprehension. But one thing that Lively learned through this all, and this comes out in his personality as he begins to work, is he was a man of tremendous patience. Some of these other men had very short tempers. Most of these men were bachelors. Edward Lively was not a bachelor, at least not to begin with, and he ends up with 11 children, and through that he learns a great deal about patience and endurance. He's a very easygoing, long-suffering, gentle, kind man. His children, his family life had taught him that. So he was a great man to work with. Some of the others were rats to have to work with. He was a great man to work with, so patient and so kind and so considerate because of the family that he had. One time it's told that they got so low in his house on finances and provisions that he had to sell his entire library for £3. That's, like $3. For £3 just to make ends meet that month for his family. But none of that seemed to bother him. He, however, like his wife, died, though. He died in the preliminary stages of the work in 1605. So that means that he does not actually start with the group whenever they formally began the work of translating in 1607. He did little tidbits here and there. But he died in the preliminary stages of the work in 1605, leaving 11 destitute offspring. Somehow they survived, and their descendants are now with us in the United States. If you run across anyone with that last name, Lively, you've got a good choice with 11 children here that they may trace their heritage back to Edward Lively. But that's true, that those children, all 11 of them, did make it to the United States, and all of their descendants now live in the United States. He was an Anglican. See, we know some interesting things about these people. Some we don't know anything about. Some of the things we know are boring. Some of the things are very interesting because it touches on their real life, their daily life. He was an Anglican, however. So Harding was a Puritan, Lively was an Anglican. And then the third man, Lancelot Andrewes. Lancelot Andrewes was Dean of Westminster. Now he covered all 3 locations, Oxford, Cambridge, and Westminster. Now the other two, Harding and Lively, were noted Hebrew scholars. Both were Hebrew readers. Andrews was too a noted Hebrew scholar, but he was better known for other achievements of his. He was perhaps the most famous man to work on the KJV, Lancelot Andrews, and certainly one of the most brilliant. I won't say the most brilliant. John Reynolds goes right up there as one of the most brilliant as well. But certainly Lancelot Andrews, you probably have even heard of his name before, Sir Lancelot Andrews. Certainly he is the most famous man to work on the translating committee. Now he was born in 1555, and he died in 1626. So he lived all the way through the work, saw the work completed, published, and saw the first decade and a half of its distribution. He's most famous as ending up as the Dean of Westminster. But he's famous for some other achievements of his as well. I've got 3 down here in number. First of all, he was very famous in his day for, and see, I've got a book of Andrews of his private devotions. So that's, his works and thoughts and even his devotions are still published down to this day. That's 3.5 centuries later. He was known, first of all, for his preaching ability, which attracted the attention of people all through England, including Queen Elizabeth, and he became both her and Archbishop Whitgift's private chaplain. So that's no small distinction. Lancelot Andrews serves as the chaplain to the Queen of England herself, Elizabeth. And if you ask now, why would an archbishop need a chaplain? I thought he was already a religious person. Well, when you're an archbishop, you're so involved in archbishop matters, you don't have time for your own devotions. So you have someone to preach sermons to you. But Lancelot Andrews ends up as the chaplain for Queen Elizabeth, the chaplain of Archbishop Whitgift before he dies the last day of February 1604. He was very well known for his lectures on the 10 Commandments. So preaching ability. You see, some past preachers are known just for that, preaching. Some are known for organizational skills. Some are known for scholarly abilities and insight. He happened to pretty much be known for everything, but one thing that did stand out was his ability to communicate. Secondly, he was known for his great piety of that day. He gave away much, much money. Being Dean of Westminster, he had a fairly good income. Some of these men were rich now, but many of them were poor. But he was known for his piety. And then thirdly, and this really stands out more than any of the above, he was known for his language ability. He was a master of 15 languages, spoke them all fluently. And guess what he did on his vacations? This was well known of Lancelot Andrews. He took a vacation to a new part of the world where the people spoke a different tongue. And he spent his whole month-long vacation learning that new language. And after he left there, spending a month, he had the language mastered. Can you imagine the intellectual capacities of this man to go and pick up new languages? Every time he took a vacation, he went and picked up a new language. And he spoke 15 of them fluently. The only thing he liked to do whenever he took a trip was go and find foreigners. And he would stay with those foreigners and learn their language. That's just what he enjoyed doing. I'm sure it kept his mind sharp all the time. Think how confident he would be in Hebrew and Greek. Now he was obviously, those were 2 of the languages that he knew. And you can throw Aramaic in there and throw Latin and throw German, throw any necessary language. And he knew it. Think how confident you would be in translating the Bible and if you're a fluent speaker. A speaker, some people are acquainted with 1 or 2 or 3 or 4, but fluent speaker of 15 languages. One of his contemporaries said, not contemptuously of him, that he could well have served as interpreter general at the Tower of Babel. One of his contemporaries said that. That's not a recent statement about him. That he could well have served as interpreter general at the Tower of Babel. I'm sure he could have just stayed with each family and clan long enough to pick up their language, and he could have gathered them all back together and finished the tower. He studied so much as a youth that his parents worried about him. The only other thing that he was involved in, I mean, this is the only other thing outside of, his duties that he had to do, the only other thing that he was involved in, besides taking a yearly or every other year vacation to learn a new language, was to take a daily 30-minute walk. That was part of his religion to him, that the body had to have at least 30 minutes of consistent walking each day. I'm sure someone that sat behind a desk and studied all that time really needed a 30-minute daily walk. He even took walks with Francis Bacon. Francis even asked Lancelot Andrewes his advice on writing. Now, I mean, everyone has heard of Francis Bacon. Maybe not as many have heard of Lancelot Andrewes, but Lancelot Andrewes was the better of the two intellectually. The other asked his advice on writing matters. That's how intelligent he was. Now, that gives you, look at these three men. None of these three men are intellectual wimps here. All three proficient in Hebrew, and Lancelot Andrewes proficient in 14 other languages as well. Shows you some of the ability of these men who did this work. This is not just like a Kenneth Taylor translating the Living Bible to and from work on a subway or on a train or something. These are noted scholars doing this work. A man who knows 15 languages. Notice, and that's why the King James has lasted so long. Now let's look at some of the results of the process then. The letters have gone out. Recommendations come back to these three men. Now we know something about these three men. Now they're going to present their recommendations before the king, and then the king with these three men makes the final selection of all the men who are going to be involved in the work. Okay, in July of 1604, here's how fast all of this happened. I mean, it was spring before the letters even went out. In July of 1604, the king was ready with his selection of the men based on the recommendations of Harding, Lively, and Andrewes. And so here's what happened. Number one, 54 scholars were chosen by James. The reason I'm giving you 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is it gets a little confusing what happened with these men and how we end up with conflicting accounts of the final number of men who did the work. 54 men were chosen. That much we do know, that 54 men were chosen. Number two, 7 of the 54 either died or moved away before the official beginning to the work in 1607. So that leaves us just 47 men. 7 of the men either died or moved away. One of those who died was Edward Lively that we just gave you. We know some of the ones who died or moved, and we don't know others. Now I'll give you all their names later, these 47 men. Now most lists that you come across telling us how many men did the KJV, most lists will give 47 names. Most times when you just read how many men, it doesn't list them, but it just tells you how many, you'll read 54. And so I'm explaining why you have a seemingly contradiction there. Seemingly you have a contradiction. 54 men were initially chosen, but that doesn't mean that 54 of those 54 end up actually doing the work. 7 of those die or move away. So if you're going to have them listed name by name, you couldn't come up with 54. Not the original 54 anyway, and so you have 47 names. However, still on the second point, the British Museum's list gives 47 names plus one additional one that they include as an editor. And his name was Thomas Bilson. So we're going to include him. In other words, let's maybe we can do it like this before I go any further. He chooses 54 men, 7 of them move away or die before anything even takes place. That gives us 47 men who did the work. But then British Museum list gives us one more man. That gives us 48. Maybe this would be easier to see. Now, this was King James. These died or moved. And this was the total. And the British Museum gives us one more. And this was the total. And then we're not through yet. Thirdly, the stipulation was made that other, as they called divines, that other divines would also be consulted. That is, others outside of this official number here. That other divines would also be consulted, especially on rare Hebrew and Greek words. So that just extends the number to who knows what. Other scholars would be consulted, especially on rare Greek and Hebrew terms. Plus, those not invited or consulted were free to offer unsolicited advice to the committees, which again will add to the number. In other words, you've got the number who's going to do the work, and then if they come up with a problem, then they can go outside of the final group, whatever number we're going to end up with down here at the bottom, let's just say 60, that they can go outside of the 60 and ask for advice all over England. And then besides the men here, the men to whom they go to ask advice, that is solicited advice, then other scholars can give unsolicited advice. If they've been maybe at home studying and they think they have a new insight to a Hebrew phrase or something and no one asks their opinion about it, no one has to ask their opinion. The king makes it known through all the universities that even if we don't ask your opinion and you think you know something worthwhile, write it down on a piece of paper and send it in to us, and we'll consider that. And so they got a lot of advice that way. And again, that just adds to the number. We don't really know how many final total men had a hand in doing this work. The number 4. Other sources supply at least 9 other names. 9 other definite names. Maybe I should underline the word definite. And no doubt there are probably more than this, but we know of 9 other definite names. Which what? Gives us 57 total. And this process right here is how we go about that. Now you understand this. The king starts off with 54. Some of these die or move away. It's hard to know which of the 54. We end up with 47. Some lists, for instance, I'll show you what I mean by this. Some lists that actually name out the 47 men, name some of those 7 men who died or moved away. Well, that's really not the true 47. You gave us 2 from the wrong group, and you gave us 2 from the group that died or moved away. We don't know who the 2 really were who were part of this 47 group. You see, that becomes very confusing then. Because, for instance, some of these lists of 47 give us Edward Lively. Well, he couldn't be one of the final 47 here because he's one of the 7 that died. So if you give us Edward Lively, we've got to have another name up here that you replaced with Edward Lively's name. And we don't know who that man would be because that list wouldn't provide it for us. So in other words, you've got to throw all these lists together. Now, British Museum gives us one more name, Thomas Bilson, who worked as a final editor. So that gives us 48. What about these 9 other names? Well, British Museum's list didn't give us those. And there is no, maybe this is what I need to say, no one single list in any university or museum or whatever that gives us this total 57. There are no lists that give us that. There's no list that goes beyond British Museum and says, now here are the 9 additional men. You've got to put all the lists together. Some of the men's names are spelled differently. Some of them are demoted or promoted in religious ranks in universities and schools and so forth. And so, well, I thought this man whose name was spelled this way was a professor over here. And all of a sudden on another list, you see him with a different name and at a different school. Maybe he's the same man, though. Maybe we shouldn't duplicate it and end up with 58. Maybe that's the same man after all. So it's kind of a little detective work that you have to do to be able to put all these lists together and get your scissors and paste out and align them correctly as you should. So I would say the two numbers to remember are these two numbers then. They started off with 54 men. That's what King James selected. But the men who did the work that we know about definitely were 57. We know 57 by name. And surely there were more than that. But we know 57 final men who did the work. Those are the two numbers to remember then. 54 and 57. And forget all the middle if you can't remember how we get to this. Okay, number 5. Most of the men lived in South England. Most of the men. So it was very easy for them to get to the place where the translating work was done. Either at Cambridge, at Oxford, or at Westminster. There were Anglicans as well as Puritans, filling the roles of pastors, bishops, archbishops, deans, professors, lecturers, readers, and so forth. I mean, they came from a religious background, but they came from many different vocational callings, from pastors, bishops, archbishops, to deans, professors, readers, and lecturers. Very, very few of them were married. Most of them were bachelors. The oldest man to work on the KJV, I'm giving you some of the tidbits as an aside, was Hadrian Savaria. Savaria. Hadrian Savaria. From the initial date of the letters being sent out, I'll give their ages from this. From 1604, at 1604, he was 73 years of age. He was the oldest man. He was 73. In other words, that'd make him 76 whenever the work actually began. We'll just date him to 1604 when the train starts moving on the track. The youngest man was Samuel Ward. W-A-R-D. Samuel Ward, who was 27. So they range in ages from 73 to 27. I think most of them we'll find in the 40 and 50 range, right along there. Most of them were not as old as Hadrian, and most of them were not as young as Samuel. Okay, let's get over to this business of these places. Originally, 54 men are selected by the king. They were to be divided up into 6 groups of 9 men each. That was the original plan. 6 groups of 9 men each. The 6 groups are easy to determine. 2 there, 2 there, and 2 there. But the early untimely deaths and relocation of some of the men caused things to be somewhat rearranged. The final numbers end up being quite different. Instead of having, just the proper number of men, 18 men here at each place, 9 in each committee, you'll end up with some with a higher number and some with a lower number. But the 6 groups still remain intact, although the numbers are going to vary, so that you don't really find, 2 groups here and it just fits nicely because you have 9 men in each group. The groups stay the same, but the numbers are going to shift. The Old Testament was given to 3 groups. The New Testament was given to 2 groups. The Apocrypha was given to 1 group. All right, that's all 6 groups then. And of these groups, 2 each were to meet at Cambridge, Oxford, and Westminster. And their assignments would look like this then. Westminster had Old Testament, and New Testament. One of the groups had the Old Testament at Westminster, one had the New Testament. This becomes confusing, but this is how we're going to align our whole study when we study these men. The two groups at Oxford, one had the Old Testament, one had the New Testament. If you're following along, what did Cambridge have then? The Old Testament and the Apocrypha. 3 have the Old Testament, 2 have the New, 1 has the Apocrypha. Now, of course, that's self-explanatory. The Old's larger than the New, that's larger than the Apocrypha. So that would make all this more important, especially the New than the Apocrypha. They're close to the same size. So that makes all the sense in the world. Now you can see how the work is scattered out. 54, now 57 men are going to end up, and we're going to fit them in different committees here, and Andrew and Harding are going to fit in different committees, and Bancroft and Reynolds are going to, so they're all going to be spread out. You'll see that sometimes, at, let's say, one committee at Oxford, we get a list of illustrious scholars. And then you'll go to one of the groups, let's say at Westminster, and find a bunch of nobodies there that we don't have a lot of information about. And I think, if I remember correctly, the group that did the Apocrypha happens to have some very noted scholars on that. We would think maybe you'd shift your best scholars to the Bible and put your worst scholars here for the Apocrypha. But that was not necessarily true. Okay, I've still got more time. I'm reducing some messages. 2 of them I'm trying to get into one here this morning. That's why I'm giving you a lot of information. All right, let's look at the process of work next of all. James gave very specific rules as to how he wanted each of the committees to work. And I want to give you an outline of the procedural steps. Now, later I'm going to give you the official 15 steps for all things to be done. I'll give you those 15 later, but I'm going to separate those 15 from these 7 that I'm going to give you right now. He gave 15, and I'll try to quote all 15 of them to you. 15 official steps for the work, for all things to be done. It includes the final editing and everything. But I think these 7 will get us off the ground for now and alert you to what's going on. First of all, number 1, every man in each group, 6 groups, remember, I think they range in numbers from like, 7, it's supposed to be 9, I think they range in numbers from like 7 to 10. 10, 10, 7, 7, 8. I don't see any over, any under, so we'll just stay with that now. If I have to correct myself later, I will. That would mean instead of, in each of these 2 groups at each place, instead of 9 men there's anywhere from 7 to 10. So you might have a total of 17 here at one place, 17 men. Or you might have a total even higher than that. You might have a total of 19. You might have 10 and 9 there in one place. So you've got 6 different groups, 2 meeting at each place. Each group, not each place, each group ranges in number of men from 7 to 10. And every man in that group, let's say there were at Cambridge, we could call them, Cambridge A and B for the 2 groups there. Let's say at Cambridge A, you've got 7 men. Then each man in that group was to work on his own translation of each chapter of each book assigned to that group. Now, this is very important to know because not all committees work this way. Some committees will only assign, if your group, let's say, has Romans to Jude. One group had Romans to Jude. In other words, all the epistles of the New Testament. In some Bible translation work, maybe your group has Romans to Jude, and you've got, let's say, 7 scholars there. Well, maybe one scholar is given Romans and 1 Corinthians, another is given Galatians and Ephesians, and so forth as you work your way through. And not every scholar in each committee has to translate every verse. Surely at the end you'll all review over what you've done, and you can kind of brush through what your colleagues have done, but you don't necessarily have to translate every verse yourself. Well, that is true, though, with the KJV. Every man in every group does every verse of every chapter of every book assigned to that group. For the most part, Hebrew scholars worked on the Old Testament. This is not always true, though. So many of these scholars were Hebrew and Greek scholars. But for the most part, Hebrew scholars worked on the Old Testament. Greek scholars worked on the Apocrypha in the New Testament. Now, I've said that there are 7 to 10 men. I think that the British Museum, which puts us down to, they add Thomas Bilson right here. This is what the 1 is for here. And that gives them this total of 48. I think that the British Museum list says that the numbers range anywhere from 6 to 12. So a lot of that's guesswork. It seems like the lists are confusing because of the fire that has destroyed the work that we discussed last time. But that's not important. I think we're going to discuss them as anywhere from 7 to 10 men per group, 2 groups per place, 3 places. Okay, a second step in the process of the work. You with me thus far? If you're doing Romans to Jude, then you do every single verse, Romans to Jude. And I would do every single verse, Romans to Jude. And someone beside me would do every single verse, Romans to Jude. Number 2, then each of the several groups would meet together to consider a chapter at a time the work that had been done by all involved. Now, there was no set schedule on that. Like, well, are we going to do 3 chapters before we meet, or a whole book? Just different groups met at different times. But let's say that we had finished the book of Romans, and before we go on, we would all get together, and we would all, and just see how confusing that would be if 7 of us had done that, translated it from Greek over into English, and we're going to go back and compare every single word and jot and tittle in the book of Romans. Not only with just one other person, like we could shoot it back and forth, but how are you going to discuss that? You need a computer to put all of it on that to see what all 7 people have done. But that's exactly what they would do. They would gather together and discuss all the work done thus far. Disagreements, disputes were to be worked out then. So that by the time the group concluded with that book, at least the majority, that doesn't mean unanimity, the majority of the translators was in favor of the finished product. The majority was in favor. You did not have to have 100% agreement on the passage. That would kind of be worked on and out later. A third step. Once an entire book was complete, a long or a short one, Romans to 2 John, once an entire book was complete, it was then to be sent to the other 5 groups, even if their specialty was in another language. Because they were still pretty much competent in the language that was being sent to them. Once the book is complete, so let's say that Cambridge A finishes Romans. That was one of the books Cambridge A had to do. Then Cambridge A will send Romans to Westminster A, let's say, which is an Old Testament. Well, we better make that difference if I gave them, let's say, Oxford B, which did Romans, New Testament group, then would send Romans to Westminster A, which did Old Testament, and they would review it. And then they'd send it to Westminster B, and then Oxford A, and then Cambridge A and B. So that every line of every word of every line of every chapter of every book had to go really through the hands of every man, because every man in one committee would translate it, and then that work would be circulated among the 5 other groups. Of course, points of difference and dissent would come up. These were to be marked once it was sent outside of your group. Any points of disagreement were to be marked with an asterisk, the reasons for such noted, and then returned to the original group. In other words, it was a check and balance system. Everyone had a say-so in the censure of everyone else's work. Points of difference are to be marked with an asterisk, and the reasons for such difference noted, and then returned to the original group. Still on point 3. If obscurity of a rare Hebrew, Aramaic, or Greek term was the cause for a problem, then they would often seek advice from specialists not formally asked to sit with the translators. So we're back to this business of you can go and solicit outside help from linguistic specialists which have not been asked to sit with the translators. That was particularly true with rare Hebrew and Aramaic terms, not so much Greek, because Greek was much better understood than Hebrew. Hebrew has more rare words, has more of a hapax legomena or hapax legomena for the plural than in the Greek. Number 4, after each of the 6 groups had completed the books assigned to them, then a draft was to be taken before a general, smaller committee. After each of the 6 groups completes all the books, Romans to Jude is one section. I'll give you all the sections and which committees had which sections later. But after their whole section was completed, all the other 5 groups had looked it over, then a draft was to be taken before a general, smaller committee made up of either 6 or 12 men, which would mean that it was composed of either 1 or 2 men from each group. Now, you understand that? I mean, this is a minute process of check and balance and of review. Starts off with just John Smith translating Romans 1:1. But before Romans 1:1 is through, does it go through a system of checks and balances and review before they're finally settled with what they're going to have. What we're talking about now is a smaller select review committee. The whole work has been done, Romans to Jude. It's been passed around among all of the 6 groups now. The one that did it and the other 5 that review it. Now we have a small select committee. I said that it's composed of either 6 or 12 men. Now if it's 6 men, that would be 1 from each of the 6 groups. 12 would be 2 from each of the 6 groups. Why 6 or 12? We don't know which number. All of this is very sketchy. We'll look at this question later. This committee, the first committee of review, we're going to have reviews and things later. The first committee here, did it have 6 men? 1 from each of these groups, or did it have 12 men, 2 from each of these groups, or, what you'll find in some cases, did it have these 6 or 12 men, but not necessarily evenly proportioned among these groups? In other words, maybe Cambridge is not even represented, and we have to draw our 6 or 12 unevenly from Oxford and Westminster to make up from the Cambridge groups that are not represented, or one of the Cambridge groups, which is not represented. All the books have something different. I mean, I've gone through them all, and some of them say now, after the work was done, then it went before a committee of 6 men. And then you read in another book, after the work was done, it went before a committee of 12 men. Then you read another book, after the work was done, it went before a committee of 6 men, 1 from each group. Then you read another one, it went before a committee of 12 men, not necessarily 2 from each group. So it's just mass confusion, and I think that's because some of the records have been destroyed and we just don't know. But we do know it was a committee of either 6 or 12 men. And I don't think that there were exactly 1 or 2 men from each group representing each group here on this committee. That does not seem to be the case. Who we think this committee was, I mean the people that made up this committee of 6 or 12, I'll give that to you later. We've got some of the names that we think we can piece together. And it seems like that they are not proportioned very properly. Okay, number 5. The final drafts were to be read before the entire committee and expertise on technical problems could still at this point be sought outside the realm of the translating team. This is similar to 4, but we're adding a point on to 4. We've got the committees. The final drafts are read before the entire committee of 6 or 12. And if they still need help, well, it's really useless to go back to any of the translators. It's already gone through them enough. And if you still need help on something, then you can go outside of the 54, 47, 57 men and seek additional help. Then, number 6, the entire work was to be reviewed very carefully by 2 final editors. The entire work was to be very carefully reviewed by 2 final editors. One of them we already know, because this is what British Museum added on to the typical 47 you see in so many works. One of these men we already know was Thomas Bilson. He was Bishop of Winchester and was not on the translating team. Now we throw in another clog into our wheel here. In giving us this list of 57 total men, now we have a man who ends up listed because he's final editor, one of 2. But he actually was not one of the men on any of these committees here. So now you almost have to subtract one, but I wouldn't say subtract it because he does change some of the wording. So that means he had some role in the translation. But he did not work on any of these committees here. The other man did work on one of the committees, the Oxford Old Testament Committee. And that was Miles Smith. He had been a translator on the Oxford Old Testament Committee. Miles Smith, who was canon of Hereford and later Bishop of Gloucester. We'll discuss him more. Miles Smith. Now, I've already said what I wanted to say about this man. Lancelot Andrews, extremely intelligent, probably the most famous man as far as name recognition is concerned, that worked on the committee. Probably the most important man was this man right here. And the other important one that I've mentioned is this man, John Reynolds, you know. But Miles Smith, an editor has great sway over how that work is going to look in its final production. He can change anything he wants to change. And he's almost God as far as the work is concerned. Miles Smith not only is a brilliant scholar and worked on one of the groups, the Old Testament Oxford group, but he is one of the final editors, much more important than Thomas Bilson. He is also the man who writes the entire preface that we will study paragraph by paragraph, entitled The Translators to the Reader. Miles Smith works on the Old Testament group. He's final editor and the most important of the 2 final editors, Miles Smith, Thomas Bilson. He's also the one who writes the entire preface entitled The Translators to the Reader. Very important man, Miles Smith. The number 7, and finally this morning, the work was sent to the printer, whom we will discuss later, who the printer was. Finally, the work is sent to the printer. That would be 1611.